Good evening and welcome everybody. My name is Councillor Polly Billington. I'm Chair of Skills Economy and Growth Scrutiny Commission and Ward Councillor for de Beauvoir. Just a few bits of housekeeping before we go on. I'd like to welcome you all to the Scrutiny Commission this evening. We make sure that everybody can speak, and to be heard, we need to make sure that we have good microphone discipline, as this is a hybrid meeting and will be watched online by the public and indeed by the press. So I've got my microphone on all the time, but you will need to have your microphone on when you speak, but you'll also need to switch it off when you have finished speaking, otherwise the other microphones won't come on. So it requires a little bit of discipline. I might need to nudge you, but I'm just warning you now that we will do this. The meeting should not go on beyond 9 o'clock. I'm a pretty strict chair, so if you have been asked to speak for 10 minutes, you will have 10 minutes. You will not have more. The meeting is being recorded and live streamed, as I say. Keep your microphones on mute, whether you are speaking in the chamber or virtually. And if you would like to speak, you can, of course, raise your hand. I've got everybody who is joining us virtually in front of me on my laptop, so they can raise their hands either like that or by using the hand raising function on Google Meet. And obviously everybody in the room can raise their hands in the usual way. There is a chat function for those people who are on Google Meet, but that is only to be used for technical issues and to bring something to my attention, like you wish to speak, not for sharing information any further than that. And again, I'm just going to remind you that the press may well be in attendance virtually, even if they aren't here in the room. So we'll just go on to the first items on the agenda. Initially, we have an introduction and apologies for absence. I've introduced myself. To my left is Councillor Potter, the Vice Chair of the Commission. Over here are the members of the Commission, and we have our guests in front of us. Tracy is our support officer who has managed to make all of this work virtually, and there are a couple of other very special people who are only online and entirely behind the scenes who basically make sure that everything works. We have a couple of members' apologies. Councillor Race has apologised and it will not be here with us this evening, and Councillor Lynch is joining virtually. You will all be aware that with the rules that have been imposed on us by national government, despite the fact that we have hybrid connectivity and Councillor Lynch will be able to contribute to the meeting, unfortunately the rules mean that she doesn't formally count as being part of our choracy. So thank you to Councillor Lynch for attending and being able to contribute despite the rules of the national government reflecting some challenges for us at local government level. We don't have any urgent items or order of business, so unless anybody has anything urgent now, I'd like people to raise their hands if they have any declarations of interest that are different from the ones that are already on the record. Good, thank you, that's great. We have up to an hour and 45 minutes for this meeting, which I'm really pleased about because this is an issue for a lot of our residents, and I'm pleased that we can really get into it in some detail. We will start with presentations, and I've asked the Commission simply to be ready for asking questions of clarification between each of those presentations. And then once we've had those presentations from our guests, we will go into a deeper question and answer session from the members of the Commission. We'll have Transport for London for 10 minutes, then our Bus Users UK contribution, London TravelWatch, who I think London TravelWatch are joining us remotely, is that right? Yes, so Alex is joining us remotely. Thank you very much, Alex, for joining us that way. And then we've got London Borough of Hackney. I think we're first having the street scene contributions, and then secondly, a combination of Councillor Maxwell and Sonia from our policy team. So that's the way it's going to run. Just a brief introduction on what we're here to discuss. I'm sure you will all be aware that Transport for London have proposed new changes to London's bus network. We're mindful that over the last 5 years there have been changes which have resulted in bus routes in Hackney being removed and other bus routes being rerouted to alternative destinations. We know how essential buses are for most of Hackney's residents, and that we all use them to get to work, to get to school, to the doctors, and to see our friends and family. In addition, many people with disabilities in Hackney rely on the buses for their independence as a fully accessible and affordable form of public transport. When there are planned changes to the buses, like Transport for London is currently proposing, it is important for us we understand what impacts they may have on everyone. With the bus network being a critical part of the public transport system in Hackney, we almost describe ourselves as a tube-free borough, although technically we have one access point at Manor House. This discussion will consider the bus network in Hackney in the light of the proposed changes by TfL to London's bus services. This discussion is to ensure TfL have explored all avenues to mitigate any negative socioeconomic connectivity and frequency impacts to Hackney's borough's residents, businesses and workers. This item will also be informed by the information submitted to the Commission from residents. We have had a focus group for residents, we've conducted a number of surveys, councillors and community organisations, and indeed Hackney Council's own workforce. They have given us their views and expressions and experiences of London's bus service in Hackney. We know the consultation formally closed in early September, and we know that TfL is going through that decision-making process now. Therefore, we understand absolutely that this conversation is not one where we expect TfL to confirm the outcome of those consultations. We simply want to understand more about the way you came about the proposals that you have in front of you. And we are keen as well to make sure that the challenges facing our residents are fully understood. So I'd like to welcome to the meeting the presenting officers. Initially, we have Jeff Hobbs, who's the Director of Public Transport Service Planning and Transport for London, and Dylan Beeson, who is the Community Partnership Specialist at Transport for London. Over to you, Jeff and Dylan, and let me just remind you it's 1906, so you have until 1916. Yeah, please use the microphone, and it'll probably work about there, but you can move it if you like.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair, for the introduction. I am indeed Jeff Hobbs from Transport for London. I have some slides which are up on the screen and cleverly shared with those of you online. So if we go on to the first slide, these are the sorts of things which I was asked to specifically try and talk about. Some of the challenges facing the London bus network, some of the nature of the Central London Bus Review, but I have to be a little bit careful just at this juncture about what I say. Specific around that is the equality impact assessments that we did with respect to the proposals, and things around the bus action plan and how can Hackney help. So if we go on to the next slide, thinking specifically about challenges, you'll see a graphic up there which is a schematic of the 32 London boroughs set out in squares, and it shows the first challenge facing the bus network, which is recovering our passengers after the pandemic. And this particular graphic shows what it was like at the end of September compared to the equivalent day back in 2019, prior to the pandemic. And you can see a mixed pattern across there. Some of the outer London boroughs are rather higher, sort of Hillingdon on the left-hand side is darker there, it's colour-coded, 99%, whereas some of the inner London boroughs, Westminster, for example, 78%, Kensington and Chelsea, 70%. You'll see Hackney there at 83% of what it used to be. So absolutely, that's a challenge of restoring our level of demand, all sorts of things beyond COVID, with technology and changes to travel patterns as a result, notably, with this meeting in mind, the fact that so many meetings are hybrid and it reduces the need to travel. And also, you've also got the changes in the rest of the public transport network. In this neck of the woods, things to do with the Overground, Victoria Line, Lea Bridge Station, etc. And of course, we've also got, over the medium terms, certainly since 2014, challenges around bus speeds and trying to maintain the competitive advantage of the bus relative to all other modes of transport. If we go to the next slide, the next challenge I want to draw to your attention is around the consequence of that in terms of subsidy. So you've got a chart there, one for 2019-20. The blue bar is our costs of running the bus network. The red bar is our fares revenue. And you can see by 2021-22, the red bar has shrunk a lot because of all the reasons I mentioned earlier. notably COVID, whereas the blue bar around costs has stayed the same. In other words, the amount of subsidy required is approaching £1 billion now, up from about 700 million before the pandemic. And obviously, the conclusion from all this is that money and budgets are a real challenge. If we go on to the next slide, there's a map which shows the nature of the Central London bus review that we are undertaking. And on the left-hand side in the blue bar, picked out some of the routes which are more relevant to Hackney. And what the map shows is the analysis that we've done to try and make sure that when we undertake this review, we're doing things which are rational in the sense that, given the need to save money, that we're doing the least possible damage that we could ever possibly do. There are 675 routes in London with all different frequencies and different vehicles and so on and so forth. We want to make sure we're doing the least worst things. And to do that, we've looked at all sorts of different ideas and happened upon Central London simply because that's where demand has been most suppressed over the course of post-pandemic. But also, in advance of that, we had falling levels of demand since 2014. And we've looked at all the main corridors to and from Central London, picked out in red on this map, and looked at the current frequencies aggregated across all different routes. And you'll see the current and the proposal. And the one that's most relevant there is probably the one to do with Old Street and Kingsland Road. And you can see the frequencies there for current and proposed. What I wanted to make point there is that Central London has some very, very high frequencies in aggregate, and these would remain even if the proposals go ahead unaltered. If we go on to the next slide, you also asked us about the Equalities Impact Assessment and what it told us about the bus network. So another reason why I am confident that the Central London Bus Review looks at routes which are less impactful is that the impact upon, to use the jargon of the Equalities Act, is less impactful upon people with protected characteristics. So, for example, the routes affected by the proposals in Hackney, 4% are disabled compared to 14% of London residents as a whole, and 6% are younger people compared to 32% of London as a whole. There are other groups I could quote lots of statistics in the Equality Impacts Assessment. They're all available on the website. They're quite a volume of data. Another one, older users, 12% of passengers make up the Hackney routes compared to 11% of Londoners as a whole. So taking across the piece, there's no particular, there's no great overemphasis in terms of the adverse impact on people with protected characteristics. And that's another reason why we have consulted on these particular routes. A specific question that you asked was, does the EQIA take into account the cumulative impact over the past 5 years? So the answer to that is no, but, and of course, if one did that for 5 years, then why 5 years as opposed to 7 or 3 or anything else? This is evaluated on now versus the future. And in any case, if one looked back over 5 years, one would also need to take account of other impacts upon public transport, notably, for example, the slow but steady increase in the number of step-free access stations in this borough and elsewhere. If we go on to the next slide, I was aware of the time ticking by, you asked also about the hopper fare. So taking London as a whole, we looked at this specifically, and the impact of the proposals is to increase 0.2% of trips, moving from less than 60 minutes to over the 60-minute threshold. So it's a fairly small impact. If one looks specifically at Hackney, then there's a bit of arithmetic there set out on the slide about how the average length of bus ride in Hackney is 2.1 miles and how long that takes at the average bus speed. which is well within the hour's length. So we don't think it's a material impact taken across the piece. If we go on, we did want to mention the bus action plan, which sets out all the things that we would like to do in terms of safety and security, the customer experience, the impact of the bus network upon the environment, connections and journey times. There are all sorts of things that we can do to work together to make even more of the bus network. The biggest single one is around journey times. When journey times get worse, we lose passengers. It's fairly axiomatic. People like me like doing statistical exercises. I can give you all sorts of data about this, but suffice to say, it's exactly as one might expect. If the bus service gets worse because it gets slower, journey times get longer, and we lose usage, and potentially we lose trips from sustainable modes, walking and cycling and public transport, to the car and others. So we're very keen to work with you, just as we have in many ways in the past, to try and protect the competitive advantage, if I can put it like that, of the bus network. Turning to the last slide, I think that, and maybe I would say this, but I can evidence this, that over in public transport as a whole, Hackney's public transport offer has got a lot better over the course of, take the longer view over the past decade. And I say that because not only can I point at all sorts of improvements over that time. I mean, I mentioned North London Line gone up from, it's the 15th birthday, actually, of London Overground last Friday, and it's the 10th birthday of the East London Line Phase 2 coming up very shortly. I mention this simply because go back to that period of time, and the frequency of the service at Hackney Central would have been a train every quarter of an hour, and now there's a train every 6 minutes or so, 10 trains an hour. And similarly, East London Line opened in 2010, gone from nothing to 16 trains an hour. The electrification of Gospel Oak Barking, not in the borough itself, but not very far away. The Victoria Line, now 36 trains an hour for a full 3 hours in the morning, and then again in the evening peaks, which is, I can look anyone in the eye with that one and say that's world beating. At Finsbury Park Station, just across the boundary from Hackney. And Thameslink, of course, also at Finsbury Park. Lea Bridge Station, step-free access at the whole, at half a dozen or so stations now where there wasn't before. So we're making progress, and we're doing so together. And I think that is making a difference, if only because you have a rather spectacular, compared to any other borough in London, 86% of sustainable mode share. That's walking, cycling and public transport, that bit of jargon. And that's up over the course of the last decade, or since 2012 anyway, from 81%. So it seems to suggest that some combination of what we're doing across public transport, not just buses, is making a difference. And you're helping with that in terms of the support you're giving to the bus network. A bus that is moving is one that is generating passengers and achieving the goals that we jointly want to see.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I'm just aware of time. Is that all right with you?
Yes, I've pretty much said what I ought to have said.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That was a great run through. Are there any questions of clarification from the Commission? No? That's great. Well, can we move on to Alex Smith, who's Head of Campaigns at London TravelWatch? Alex, you're joining us virtually. Can you hear us all right?
Yes, I can. Sorry, just unmuting there.
That's great. Do go ahead. You've got 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. And apologies, I can't be there in person today. So some of this has already been touched upon by Jeff. But in terms of buses, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, they're used by more Londoners than any other type of public transport. And they're really the backbone of how a lot of people move around the city. It's the most accessible, affordable and citywide way for people to travel. So it's really important, particularly given that our research in London TravelWatch has found that bus passengers tend to be on lower incomes. They're more likely to be people of colour, women or younger people. And these groups are most likely to be hit hardest by any cuts or changes to bus services alongside disabled people as well, and older people who again might rely on buses in their day-to-day lives. So that's why London TravelWatch have expressed concern about proposed changes to bus services. They'll be impacting, I think it's 78 routes across 23 boroughs. I'll double check those figures, including the withdrawal of some services completely and affecting a lot of people across the board. And while we do accept that sorry, apologies, funding conditions do mean that TfL has to make significant financial savings, we think it's really important that where possible this is done in a way that minimises disruption to people travelling around London, doesn't disadvantage people who can least afford it, and doesn't stop people from making their journeys altogether. So there are three sort of top issues that we're most concerned around with the most recent bus cuts proposals. The first is changing between buses. I should say, obviously, these will also impact Hackney as well as across the city in general. So changing between buses, if these proposals go through in full, I think we found that there would be 93,000 daily journeys on day bus routes. So this is just day routes, not night buses, that will involve a change of bus where it doesn't currently. And some people might have to change more than that 2 or 3 times. So that obviously increases journey times, which, as Jeff mentioned, is kind of likely to put some people off potentially travelling at all, or maybe as frequently. And also just reduces the quality of the journey as well. You're obviously having to wait at a bus stop if there's not necessarily a countdown screen, so you don't necessarily know when it's coming, or there's not necessarily seating. And it's particularly worse for disabled people. As I mentioned, it's the only affordable and accessible way to travel or form of public transport to travel around London. So aside from these issues, again, if you have to force people to change buses, particularly if it's not at the same bus stop, those buses themselves might be accessible, but the journey between those bus stops might not be. There might not be sort of drop curbs that you need. There might be street furniture that's in the way. And again, it's just making it harder for people to travel and potentially putting things off. So we've kind of said that if a change is required, wherever possible, make sure that it can be made at the same bus stop. And the last first point was around changing buses. Second point was accessibility, which I've touched on a bit already, but also if there's less frequent buses or certain reduced capacities on certain routes, then that could also reduce priority seating for wheelchair users, people with push chairs, priority seating. And again, it's just kind of reducing that quality, particularly for those groups of people. And then the last sort of big area that we're concerned is around safety, in particular the night bus. So if there's less frequent buses and more journeys that require a change, it's not necessarily just an inconvenience, it could be a real safety issue for people. If you've just missed your bus and you now have to wait up to 30 minutes in the dark, potentially in the cold, when you're all by yourself, that can be, a real concern for people. Especially if you're in an unfamiliar location, you feel unsafe. And again, does it just put off people traveling? We know from our research that I think it's nearly half of women just won't travel at certain times at all because they just don't feel safe doing it. So again, we don't want to put people off, so we need to make sure there are regular services so that they can use them. So we've kind of been pushing for TfL to abandon their night bus proposals completely. Looking at the wider concept again, as Jeff mentioned, bus journey times are getting slower. I think some of that is around a lack of bus prioritization and available road spaces. But again, if you're kind of making people change more, that will also feed into it. So it's just kind of wherever we can, making sure that using the bus is still an attractive and viable prospect for a lot of people. Good for the environment as well. I think we know if the mayor's to meet his target of 80% of journeys in London being made by cycling, walking and public transport, we need a 40% increase in bus use. So really important for that as well. Just a little bit briefly on Hackney specifically. So as we mentioned, Hackney doesn't really have a tube network. There has been the benefit from the expansion of the London Overground, but in general it is still very reliant on the bus. So again, it's just making sure that it's really important, and just acknowledging as well that I think it's 2018 bus cuts and consultation as well, some of that did impact Hackney, again leading to some of the issues that we've already touched upon in terms of having to change bus more, making journeys harder and more difficult for people. So just thinking about in that context as well. I think that is everything from me.
Thank you very much, Alex. Are there any questions for clarification from the Commission? No, that's great. I think we'll want to ask a little bit more about those changing all at the same bus stop and those 93,000 changes, Alex. That's very, very interesting. Now, can I call on Claire Walters, who's the Chief Executive of Bus Users UK? Claire.
Hi, thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to the other speakers. I'm also the Cabinet Office appointed Disability and Access Ambassador for Bus and Coach, working for passengers, not for the Cabinet Office, just in case anybody's interested. However, because of that, I'd just like to introduce myself to any visually impaired people on the call, in the public or in the press. I'm a 65-year-old white woman with a shock of white hair, wearing a black and white top and a spectacularly stylish pair of black cat's eye glasses.
I can verify the glasses, ladies and gentlemen, they're excellent.
So, obviously Bus Users UK is not just about Hackney, not just about London, but we are particularly involved in accessible and inclusive transport. So we were very concerned when we read the proposals, because we have a lot of people telling us how difficult life gets when change happens. I mean, nobody likes change, we all know that. But if you're suffering from a particular barrier to your accessible transport, then it becomes much harder. If you've got learning disabilities, you tend to have to learn your route over quite a long period of time. Therefore, any disruption to that, even if it's just because a bus has broken down or a traffic light's not working or there's a jam, causes stress. It's not just irritation or frustration, it's actual fear. And the problem with that is that it saps the confidence of everybody in trusting that journey. And confidence is a much undervalued concept when it comes to travel, wherever you go. And one of the problems that we have, we completely agree with London TravelWatch's assessment about changing bus stops. If you have to change vehicle mid-journey anyway, that's hard. It's annoying, but if you have pain when you're moving, if you are not particularly well sighted, you need to do, it all gets extra stressful. So the idea that you then got to get off, find another bus stop, talking to people, asking where this is. I mean, I speak to somebody who spent 20 minutes wandering the wrong way up Blair Street today to try and find the town hall, thanks to a satellite phone map. So if you don't even have that, if you have no access, if you're digitally excluded as well, we're hearing a lot more about that these days, then everything starts piling up and you think, you know what, I'm not going to bother. If I just have an option not to go, I just won't go. And life gets smaller and more confined, and all your aspirations go out the window. Just going out for a walk, going out for a ride, going to see something, just taking part in standard living things gets almost impossible. And it's not fair. Now, I'm sure you've heard quite a lot about Professor Marmot's research, which showed that social isolation was actually more harmful to your health than smoking, which is a shocking statistic. But when you're used to talking to people in that situation, you can understand it. Now, disabled people are twice as likely than non-disabled people to be unemployed. So if you look around Hackney, every ward in this borough has roughly 3,000 to 4,000 people who are income deprived in the indices of multiple deprivation, and every ward has around 1,000 people who are job deprived. That's an awful lot of people in this ward, in this borough alone, that really, really, really depend on buses as a reliable way of getting around. Now, clearly, London has a lot better transport system for most people than a lot of other places. But that doesn't mean it's perfect. Nothing ever is. But if you've got something that works and then you change it, you have to be prepared for that to be a punch in the snoot for an awful lot of people who really don't have any other options. So you're talking about 800,000 people in Hackney out of your, 5 million population, 16% are digitally, is that right? Is that wrong? Sorry, beg your pardon. 16% of your population are digitally deprived. They don't have access to a smartphone. They don't have access to internet anywhere. They might work in a shop. I mean, there's a lot of people sitting at home just not having anything. They just might work somewhere where those skills are not required. So we tend to see policy from the perspective of the more middle class, well-off, people who've got a debit card, people who've got a bank account, people who've got the means to do the Oyster card and the debit card and all that kind of stuff. And there's an awful lot of people who don't. So I don't want to go on beyond my time, but I've lost track of it.
You're all right. You've got another
I'm all
4
right,
minutes.
okay. So from our point of view, we don't think the consultation is sufficient because an awful lot of it goes digitally. And that's always a problem. I'm not saying it's easy, not having a go, but it's not sufficient. You stick a consultation up for a few weeks and then you go, we've consulted. You have a focus group. You get the people who can get there. You have your frequent flyers. We've all seen those in town halls where people can make the same point over and over and you know who they are. And it's not that their points are wrong. They're just not necessarily representing a community. So I would urge people to think very hard before you agree to proposals that change the journeys for lots and lots and lots of people who have no option. It's not an easy choice. And God knows I wouldn't want to be in your shoes either. But it's not easy. And I have to speak up for the people who can't be here to cry in front of you, because that's what will happen privately, quietly. People will just give up. And I'll try and stop whacking the microphone. I beg your pardon. So yes, please don't make people change journeys. And more than once is already incredibly difficult. Drivers need to be trained and trained and trained again in stopping at bus stops nice and close. The number of times I see bus drivers stopping that far away from the curbs is just too far to step across. And if you're hurting somewhere, or you're just old and creaky like me, then that step down and step up onto a pavement is just really hard. If you've got a buggy, if you've got a wheelchair, then you can't do it. And the other thing I would strongly recommend is that you stop using electric ramps on buses. Nearly every operator outside London's gone back to using manual ramps because the electric ones break down all the time. Sounds mad, it sounds like a backward step, but a manual ramp will always work.
Thank you very much, Claire. That's fantastically helpful. Any questions of clarification for what Claire had to say? No? Great. Well, then we will move on to Councillor Yvonne Maxwell, the Mayoral Advisor for Older People and Carers. Sorry? Oh, sorry, I'm getting it wrong, the wrong way around. Sorry. First, I would like to invite Dominic West, who's the Lead Officer for Public Transport and Street Scene from the London Borough of Hackney. Dominic, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Just whisk you through the presentation, which is just coming up, I think. Yeah, we have liftoff.
There it is.
That's slide number 2. So, yeah, slide number 1, slide of Hackney, slide number 2, slide number, oops. That's Hackney. We all know where Hackney is. It shows all the individual wards in Hackney. Next slide, please. So buses are an essential service in Hackney. I think we've got the highest mode share of bus users of all London boroughs at 22.6%, and we're still at the top, reflecting the fact that the bus is the main mode of transport in Hackney, and we don't have many tube stations. We only have our tube stations on the periphery. Next slide, please. I think, as Claire has said, elderly and the less ambulant are very reliant on buses, and that's particularly the case in Hackney. Our local communities, our local elderly people rely on the bus as their main mean of transport. Next slide, please. Hackney's already had its bus network has had quite a few cuts over the years. We started off, we had routes at 308, which was taken away from Leighton Asda when it was diverted to the Olympic Village. The D6 was cut back to Ash Grove. 277 was cut back from Highbury and Islington to Dalston. 242 withdrawn between St Paul's and Liverpool Street. 48 withdrawn, and frequency cuts on over 50% of Hackney's bus network, including night buses, in just over 3 years. Next slide, please. And we know that there's more to come. Before the Central London bus changes were announced, there were some previous cuts announced as part of TfL's proposal of route simplification. We know that Route 21 is going to be withdrawn away for Southgate Road and diverted up the 271 route, which is being withdrawn. Route 56, it is proposed to miss out Barts Hospital, an important cancer screening centre, residents in the borough. Route 135 proposal is currently to withdraw it from Old Street and to divert it via the 242 route. The 236, and again an important route for Hackney Wick and Hackney, withdrawn between Homerton and Hackney Wick, so that's the eastern end of the route, leaving only the 276. Route 242, as I've stated, replaced by the 135, but will it serve Liverpool Street, where everybody wants to go, rather than Aldgate, where everybody doesn't want to go? And also the 349 being withdrawn. That's a snippet of some of the forthcoming changes. Next slide, please. Interchanges must be convenient and sheltered. I think when I watched the Vox Pop over the weekend, it was interesting that one of the biggest comments from residents and from users was about the loss of the 277 to Highbury and Islington. Again, that's still very much an issue in Hackney. The interchange for the 277 is on Dalston Lane. That's the first. If you're coming off a bus from Highbury and Islington, you get off at Dalston Lane because that's the most convenient interchange. Well, that's the only interchange. As you can see, it has no shelter. It's a congested pavement, and in the rain, it's not a very nice place to wait. Not a very nice place to wait in the dark. Not a very nice place to wait in the light either. So that is an example of a very poor interchange in Hackney as a result of some of the more recent route changes. Next slide, please. Yes, think about the passengers. This is the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is a 24-hour bus lane on the A10. Well done, TfL. The bad is the bus stop at Old Street, which has been temporarily, capital T, removed for works to the roundabout. And again, this was pointed out by some of the users in the Vox Pop. It's a long gap between the stop outside Argos on Old Street and the next one down, which is almost effectively Great Eastern Street. Very long gap between stops. And I think it's quite frankly something we have to do something about. And then the ugly, you can't see it from the picture, but that's a row of buses outside Ashgrove Garage stuck in a bus lane while the drivers change over shifts, leaving quite a lot of frustrated passengers on the buses in the process. One of the vagaries of the bus tendering regime. Next slide, please. And what are we doing in Hackney? Well, we're not just moaning, we are actually promoting the bus, and we've been doing that by extending the hours of operation of our bus lanes. This is one in Mare Street, which we've just recently extended the hours of. And also, not just bus lanes, but we're putting in bus filters, low traffic neighbourhoods. This is one of the examples that we put in just during the pandemic. Broadway Market, you'll recognise it. And Jeff, you'll recognise one of those white buses, which we don't normally see. These were the additional school buses that were put on to cater for school children during the pandemic. So we've captured a white bus in Hackney. Moving on, please. Yes, again, our public transport efforts, our encouragement to use public transport. That's all part of our multimodal approach in Hackney. 87% of trips made by walking, cycling, or public transport, which even TfL have praised us for. So I think we're probably, I'm not sure if we're at the top. If we're not at the top, we must be pretty near the top. I'm getting nods, so we probably are at the top. So we'll take that as a yes. London's highest cycling rate, 48 school streets and 16 new low traffic neighbourhoods, rebuilding a greener Hackney. Next slide, please. And finally, what we'd like to see from TfL. In a nutshell, in 4 words, more zero emission buses, please. We've only got 2 zero emission bus routes that run through the centre of Hackney, 2 on the periphery. Not a lot really, but the only way is up. So hopefully we'll get some more zero emission buses in Hackney. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic. That was great. Any questions or clarification from the Commission? No, great. Well, then we can move on to hear from Councillor Yvonne Maxwell. Sorry for introducing you early, Yvonne. And then to hear from Sonia too.
Sonia's going to start and I'll sum up.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair. So I'm going to just speak for about 7 minutes and then hand over to Councillor Maxwell. I think, key points to make. First of all, Hackney adopted an Ageing Well strategy in 2020, and public transport is a key part of that strategy of how we, oh, sorry, I'm just checking. Tracy, you're presenting. Oh, okay, fine. Thought I was. Next slide, please. So public transport is a key aspect of how we support people to age well. Next slide, please. And the key reason that we wanted to come here today and give the views of older people is because good transportation is about helping people to age well and becoming an age-friendly city. So this isn't about the considerations about different equality groups and whether older people are impacted the same as other groups. This is about the fact that if bus routes change and buses change, then older people cannot be supported to age well, and we can't be as age-friendly a city. Next slide, please. I'm providing this national research just to bring this to life. There isn't time to go through it now, but I'm providing it to the Commission, to members for your consideration. It really brings to life the wider opportunities that there are from having a good bus network in terms of benefits for social, economic, and healthier lives as well. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. This is, again, a slide that I won't talk through, but it's provided as evidence, profile of older people. Older people in Hackney are more likely to be deprived, to not drive, and the over 65 proportion in Hackney is growing. So we want to continue to be an age-friendly borough. We want this to be somewhere where people can come and live, be connected, stay, and again, bus routes are key to that. So if we can go on to the next slide. I've got 3 slides that go through insight from older people. So first of all, bus journeys can't just be seen from the perspective of the commute. And if we do look at it that way, then we may make assumptions about the move to home working, for example. Old people can't do the sorts of things that they want to use a bus for remotely, socialising, going to the doctors, taking exercise. Buses are more accessible than trains, we've heard that already, and can't be seen as an alternative. Even if there is step-free access, and I'll go into more detail on that. For those who do want to connect with the tube at Highbury, Old Street, Finsbury Park, Manor House, this is more challenging now if people are already having to change buses to get to a tube. And we only have tube stations on the borders in Hackney, as we've already heard. Car ownership is low. We want to keep it that way. And so we want to do what's required to reduce that rather than increase car ownership. If we go on to the next slide. Some of the insights from older people show that there is a risk that car ownership could increase faced with a broken journey or inaccessible trains. A car or cab might well seem like a better option if people can afford it. But as we've already seen from the stats, many older people can't afford to pay a lot for transport. So they're likely to not do activities anymore. Particular issues raised, we've already heard about difficulties for anyone with buggy, small children, mobility. The new bus that you need to connect to isn't always at the same bus stop, may involve crossing roads. Heard a lot about waiting at bus stops after dark, making people feel more at risk, be more at risk. Not all changeovers are at obvious hubs, they can be quite quiet. And just the way that that may mean people have to walk, and all the ways that people then are inhibited from making that journey at all. Next slide, please. And so some other insights that we've heard through the Ageing Well strategy is older people would like an ongoing voice with bus franchises, which may be linked to some of the asks from TfL today. Training for bus drivers on passenger comfort, access. Again, we've heard about freedom passes, removal of time restrictions. Life's changing, and where people need to get to, this sort of idea of on-peak, off-peak is different. And then, as has already been mentioned by Dominic, some of the needs, some of the things the council will do will be to continue to prioritise bus lanes. And final point to make that came out in the insight is that older people, the routes that go through residential streets can be a lifeline, going back to that point about it's not just a commute, dropping older people close to home and also close to shops. And the final slide just explains where I got this insight from. So from the Commission's own survey, so far a good proportion, 23 out have been over 55s. The majority have been affected already. The Ageing Well strategy also was co-produced and so revealed the insight, some of the insight I've shared. And Hackney has an older citizens committee, a 40-strong group of residents who have been engaged and have provided testimonies as part of this. Handing over to Councillor Maxwell.
Thank you, Sonia. Councillor Maxwell.
Thanks. Yes, I just want to sort of sum up and highlight some points. Sorry, I just managed to turn my computer off. Sorry about that. I mean, I think the bus cuts will impact older people, and I know we've heard about equalities, but if you just look at older people as a whole group, you're not looking at the intersection where you've got older people who are on lowest incomes, and they're the ones that are going to be most impacted by this. So I think the bus cuts are an equality issue here. It's not just, and it's also not just about the numbers. We can't, they can't access tubes. We've looked at, Sonia's looked at income deprivation and poverty and people's income, and we know large numbers of older people can't afford cars. We don't actually want them to be buying cars, and those that do have cars, we want them to use them less. So we actually do need accessible, safe and affordable public transport. I think if people can't use buses and they're not going to use cars, I'm sorry, they're not going to be getting on bikes. I know we want them to, but the conversations, if I suggest that to some older people, I can't really repeat the answer I get. They want to use buses and go out like that. Some will use bikes, but we need to be realistic. If we want to reduce car use, we need to have the buses. And that also encourages people to walk more and helps with health and well-being. What I wanted to make was, and I think Sonia's touched on this, and I think you did as well, Claire. I really liked your presentation because I think that brought a lot of this to life. There is a wider discussion about public transport and buses. It's not just about how many buses we have. It's about more seats and shelters at bus stops. It's about having drivers wait for older people or less mobile people to actually sit down. The amount of times I've seen people go flying, it's not just older people, it's people with buggies, but it's like there's some awareness raising needed with drivers, allowing people time to get off the bus. My one I always notice is the bus is backing up and people having to walk a lot further, and the older people, a lot of us sort of stand there thinking, is it going to come round, is it not? And people can't move fast enough to get the bus. Your point about stopping near the curb is, I see that so often, it stops further down. So I think there is a wider conversation to be had about older people and buses. And I think it was a few months ago, or it might be the end of last year, Councillor Cobain came to our Hackney Older Citizens Committee to talk about public transport. There was a real interest from that group to continue this conversation, to look at these wider areas. So one thing I think I would like to see come from this is that we can have a wider conversation with older people, with TfL, with officers, looking at their needs around it. But I mean, just to finish off on what Sonia's saying around aging well, if people can't go out, and your point, people just give up. If people can't easily go out with a bus that is near, and it's more difficult for them, and they have to change buses, they're not going to be going out, and that has a huge impact on people's health and well-being. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor Maxwell. Any questions for clarification, or shall we open it up? I think that's been a fantastic array of presentations which have outlined the challenge that TfL has, outlined some of the opportunities and some of the potential solutions, but also some of the really big barriers and issues around bus use in our borough for everybody, making sure that it is ultimately a service that can serve everybody. I'd like to open up then to the Commission. If anybody would like to, Councillor Potter and then Councillor Lynch. Councillor Potter.
Thank you for your presentations, very powerful, from London TravelWatch, the Bus Users Group, and Councillor Maxwell and Sonia and Dominic about, you know, the experience of older people and also those with disabilities. I just wanted to go in a little bit more into the kind of granular detail with you, Jeff, if you don't mind, just in terms of so in terms of the work that you've done in looking at the impact on those with mobility issues, we've established that, you know, for, you know, people with mobility issues, older people, etc., that they are going to find it really difficult to have to do changes. Have you done detailed analysis of the kind of journeys that people take to the kind of places, hospitals, big supermarkets where people go, and to minimise those changes on what is perceived as the kind of key journeys that are needed to be carried out? And the other question I wanted to ask, on page 104, you talk about the equality impacts on older people and disabled people, and you talk about the new direct journey opportunities with new links provided on 29 bus routes. Could you provide some detail for those direct journeys in Hackney that could show the positive impact?
So how have we tried to minimise the adverse impacts? So the problem I've been trying to solve is one that it is well known that TfL has a large financial problem, and so therefore, how does one reduce costs because fares revenue is so much lower for the least worst outcomes? And the routes that we put forward for this proposal, we quite deliberately picked with one of the criteria being that the impact on people with protected characteristics was a good deal lower than average. So disability is one example. So London-wide, it's 14%, whereas these routes taken across the piece, there's just 3% of passengers with that particular characteristic. So that's one example. Then once there is a truly voluminous amount of paperwork on the website which describes what the nature of those adverse impacts are. Not making any pretense that there are adverse impacts, but it describes how between the network that we've got now and the network that is proposed, how one would cope with that change, and for example, how we try to ensure that it's in nearly every occasion same stop interchange, not every occasion, the vast majority, for example, and that the quality of that change.
Sorry, Jeff, what's the percentage?
I can find out for you, but it'll be about 90% easily.
90% is
Yeah.
one with the same stop change.
Yes.
So what the bus users group and so forth are asking for, we've got in 90% of the route changes that we're talking
Yes,
about.
that's it. And also, is the quality of that interchange up to scratch or not? By which I mean, is seating and lighting and
The Dalston Lane problem.
and shelter, the Dalston Lane problem. So, and as it happens, we find that the vast majority, again, of the required additional interchange is up to scratch. Not all of it. And then it sets out, this documentation sets out, if you've got the willpower to go through it all, and it is not an easy read, but it is very worthy. It sets out what things that we could do to provide additional quality interchange where it's lacking at the minute. Sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not. But we've gone through that in quite a lot of detail. Then there's also, this might seem a bit paradoxical, but why have we gone for the approach of withdrawing routes rather than another approach to saving money, given saving money I am obliged to do? It doesn't make me feel great, but the government has set out a budget. There's all sorts of funding agreements. They're all in the public domain. This will be nothing new to all you working in London Borough of Hackney or any other council, I imagine. One is obliged to do it, so it's again about the least worst. So I could choose to, should I so wish, just reduce frequencies on all bus routes equally. But the impact of that would actually be worse, paradoxically, because there is a large minority of people who interchange bus to bus. And if you reduce the frequencies, then the waiting time for that interchange and the quality of those interchange gets much worse. And if you look at the feedback responses from the consultation, then that is your number one factor about affecting the quality of interchange, how long you got to wait at the second bus stop. So that's why we've gone down this approach of withdrawing routes, but trying to keep frequencies high in order to try and protect that large minority of people that do make bus-to-bus interchange, because we are only too well aware that maintaining quality is absolutely important if we're not to lose a disproportionate number of passengers, and thus being self-defeating in trying to enhance our financial sustainability, which is what the challenge that the government has set us in our funding agreements. So there's some of the ways in which, does that help in sort of?
There was a second question,
Yes.
which is about the suggestion in the quality impact assessment about positive outcomes from these proposals for older people. And I think Councillor Potter wanted you to be specific
Yes.
about what that might be.
So here's a couple of examples. So the 26 currently goes to Waterloo, and the reason we're diverting it to Victoria, and that means that the reason why we're doing that is we've got many more buses going over Waterloo Bridge than there are passengers. It's sort of 90 buses an hour or near offer, which is a bus every sort of 45 seconds or better. And so there'll be new opportunities to go direct to Victoria. Another example would be the effective merger, if you like, of the 242 and 135 routes. So there'll be a direct link through to along Commercial Street and along Commercial Road and into Docklands as a result. So they're the sorts of new links which are implied by the proposals. There are lots more, but they're two examples of the sorts of things which are newly enabled by this, which is not to deny that other links are broken. And we've been very upfront about that, about the nature of those broken links, and that one of the more interesting and heavily studied parts of the feedback is how it's all of your ideas and the general public at large about how we can minimise and reduce it further, because at the risk of cliche, we haven't got the haven't got a monopoly of good ideas. And
Thank
very
you,
often
Jeff. Can I just take some further contributions? Councillor Lynch, any others from the Commission? Councillor Walker, Councillor Premaru, and then Councillor Narkos. If I take all of those, and then we'll be able to answer them collectively, if that's all right. So Councillor Lynch first.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies again, I can't be there in person. My question is to Jeff. Again, just echoing Councillor Potter, thank you very much for everyone's submissions today, and particularly those that have been representing the impact of these bus cuts. So we've heard from Sonia and from Councillor Yvonne today around the impact of older people, and I just wondered, did TfL do an impact on those of our health and social care staff that actually rely on our buses to get around the borough, to see our older people and our other residents who require health and social care to be given at home? And in sort of complementing that as well, did you actually do any consultation with the wider health and social care organisations, notably North East London Integrated Care System, about the impact of this? Because having sort of knowledge outside of my councillor role, I'm very mindful that there is a push for more care to be delivered at people within their homes, which will be reliant obviously on a workforce that can travel around quite conveniently to meet these needs of people that are having care delivered within their home. So that was my question really, because I think we're forgetting about that group of people that might not actually particularly be resident in the borough, but they are a key part of keeping our residents well and safe. And having worked as a district nurse, I very much relied on the buses when I was out in Islington. But I know that route round Old Street. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lynch. Then go to Councillor Walker, Councillor Premaru, and then Councillor Narkos.
Thank you, Chair. My question draws more on the accessibility issue and the affordability of cutting some of these routes. One of my questions sort of looks at cutting the 242 route, which I know you said on page 74, I think, that you've mitigated against that by extending the 135. Now, these routes are vital routes that go into the City of London, and we have many of our residents who are on lower paid jobs. So they're cleaners, they're security people who absolutely rely on these routes going into the city, and especially on the night bus routes. And if we are cutting these routes, and I know you say you're mitigating against by integrating the 135, this could have a real impact on sort of people's lives in terms of getting to work at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. And the affordability issue that I wanted to draw on also is the fact that you said in your presentation that you've made huge improvements to the transport network in Hackney as a whole. Now that is true, but many of our lower paid workers across the borough can't afford to take those other modes of transport, whether that's the overground or trains. So yeah, I'd just like you to sort of comment further really on what you've done to sort of look into that to ensure that these bus routes, remain accessible for especially some of our most vulnerable residents in the borough.
Thank you. Councillor Premaru, then Councillor Narkos.
Thank you, Chair. Question for Jeff, which is with the dual cost of living and climate crisis, how do you square the cuts and changes, which for many will mean a change from like a single bus route to multiple routes and maybe delays, with the pledge to increase demand for bus travel, for 40% active sustainable travel? And how does this fit with our commitment to low traffic neighbourhoods and the need to really make it easy for further modal shifts away from cars? Thank you.
Councillor Narkos.
Yep, thank you. So my question is around sort of passenger numbers. So you point out in your presentation that less passengers means less revenue, less fares, and there's also points out that there's a target to increase bus journeys by 40% by 2041 as well. It also mentions in 2018 there was a round of bus cuts, and I was wondering if you kind of looked at what impact that had on passenger kind of numbers, and whether you'd modelled at all what you think these round of cuts will have on passenger numbers going forward.
A lot of those for you, Jeff, unsurprisingly, I think.
Yes. Right. And, I might forget some of the questions, so just probably.
It's okay, I've got a note of
Surely good. Impact on health and social care staff. First thing to say is that not a single metre of road currently served in Hackney will not be served in the future. Not a single metre. And remember that the impact, large though it is, will mean that there will be still really quite high frequencies on all the main affected corridors. So for example, Baring Street, instead of being 23 buses an hour, will be 21. Kingsland Road, instead of being 25, will be 24. Old Street, instead of being 30, that's a bus every 2 minutes, it'll be 27. So there will remain a really dense network on every single road that there is right here, right now. So did we consult with the health and social care sector? So we've sent out, I'm hoping Dylan might be able to help me if I drop them in it just last week, literally thousands of letters and emails to stakeholders of all descriptions, including the health sector, including the social care sector. And we got thousands of responses as well. I'll get you the precise number London-wide. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but the answer is yes. So I think the next question is about the 242.
Well, it was, yes, it's about the sort of 242 as an example of how important connectivity and affordability are. I think obviously you've taken on the challenge around Hopper, but the city is a place where people think it's all pinstripes, and actually a lot of our members, a lot of our residents are going to clean the offices and to keep them safe out of hours. So we need to make sure that that service is reliable and affordable, bearing in mind the kind of changes you're proposing.
There is nothing in these proposals that affects fares one iota. And of course, the bus fares have been subject 2016 to 2020 of a fares freeze, so they are lower now than they used to be in the recent past. There will remain a very high connectivity. I've spouted various statistics about the frequencies along the main corridors. Those were peak frequencies admittedly, but there is absolutely nothing in this proposal whatsoever that cuts night bus frequencies one iota. And indeed, we kept, it sets out there how we would maintain night bus frequencies from this part of London and most others, just exactly the same as they were. What we will be doing under those proposals is to maintain the relationship between night bus numbers and day bus numbers. The object of the exercise being to try and keep this complicated system just a little bit simpler for passengers and if they diverge. Does that help with that one? About climate change.
And meeting the targets on increasing bus users and active travel. Yeah.
So what we're looking at the moment is the rate of recovery post-COVID is slowest in the morning peak. And that's when we run most buses, for obvious reasons, that it's the peak. But there is no particular virtue in environmental terms in running materially more buses than there are than you need for users in that morning peak. So it just means if on these main corridors we're running much more capacity than we got users, then we got that much more carbon emissions. And I showed a map earlier on the screen up there, which had we looked at 50 corridors into all of central London, and I mentioned Baring Street and Kingsland Road and Old Street here simply because they're ones which are close to this neck of the woods. Looked at 50 of them. We looked at the usage of all the bus routes on those, and we looked at the capacity. And in many cases, there are many multiples. The capacity provided is a multiple of the usage. I've got the 50 charts here, should you wish to look at them blow by blow. It will take a very long time up on the screen. But the purpose of this is simply to say that we are running much more capacity than we need, even at 2019 levels of demand, which is higher than there is now, at the busiest time of day, in the busiest direction, at the busiest part of those routes. There is no virtue in that in environmental terms, just because we'll just be, there's more emissions, more air quality from brake dust and so on and so forth than would otherwise be necessary. So that's why I assert that we have found a way of saving the money, which I'm obliged to save, which doesn't make me feel particularly proud, but I've found a way which we believe very strongly to be the least worst way of doing it. And that's one of the reasons why it's least worst.
And Councillor Narcos's question was what this impact has on your revenue streams. I mean, bearing in mind, if you're having fewer buses, you're going to have fewer fares. So what does this mean?
The basic relationship is that if you reduce frequencies, then journey times get longer. And if journey time get longer, for every 10% increase in journey times, you lose 6% in usage. That's the sort of mathematical bit of it. So hence, I'm very keen to find ways of reducing capacity where the impact on aggregate frequencies is relatively low, because then the increase in wait time and worsenment of journey times is least. Hence, I look at these corridors with quite high frequencies. It's not nearly the highest. Woolworth Road, not your patch, has 98 buses an hour, which is, one every 30 seconds or so. And reducing that to 90 doesn't increase waiting time very much. Similarly, for ones which are more relevant, at Old Street, there's a bus every 2 minutes. And the impact of the proposals would be to increase that to every, I think it's about 2 minutes and 10 seconds. So that's how I try and ensure that the adverse impact, which I do not deny, is minimised on impact of users and ridership, and therefore revenue.
Can I follow up on some of the? I think most of us will think, understandably, because we will be focused on town centres and where there are these pinch points and where change points will be about those focuses. But for many people, it's much less about wanting to get from Stoke Newington to Dalston and much more about getting from my house to my grandchild's school and back, or via football or whatever. And those connections are really key and important, where your high level statistics on frequency on Kingsland Road are much less relevant than, can I get off with a buggy somewhere safe? Can I get there? And will that reliability still be there for pickup times and so forth? So when you've been modelling this, bearing in mind the constraints that you've got in terms of finances and how much data you've got, because one of the amazing things about TfL and Oyster is that you have got that data about how people use our infrastructure. How much have you had to factor in the end points of those journeys well beyond the big nodes to make sure that we're really meeting the needs of people's lives? The situations where I have when people say, I can't get my kid to that school, so therefore I don't want them to go, and how much of a disruption that is, not just for that child, but for several generations of the family. How do you manage that when you're having to do the strategic solution for the whole of London, and yet also this is individual people's daily journeys?
So the first thing is, we have been very careful to try and keep the bus network on as many metres of road as it has been in the past. I said this already, but that's the first part of ensuring that there is virtually the same connectivity in the future as there is now. Then I think the other part of your question was about the reliability of the bus network. And there's a bit about network design, which is about making sure that you don't have routes that are so long that they become unmanageable. And we absolutely take that into account and try to ensure that that is remains the case. And happily, as you say, an immense amount of data on bus running. And the interesting bit there, to get a little bit technical, is not just the average speed, but the variability in it, hour on hour, day on day, week on week. And we've seen some really big swings in that over the course of the last couple of years of COVID, as traffic levels have gone up and down. And then, but most of reliability is a little bit about that, but it's much more about the day-to-day running of the service, and that's about, to use the jargon, service control. So there's a bunch of people in bus garages whose job is to track the buses on a map, because each bus is connected to GPS, and you can see them going along the map, and you want them equally spaced out so that you don't get long waits and then the proverbial 3 buses turning up at once. And that's the biggest single part of reliability, and that won't be affected at all by these proposals. In fact, it ought to be just a little bit simpler, because the network is a little bit simpler, and you can concentrate the resource on a slightly smaller number of higher frequency routes, because getting those even intervals is easier to do with high frequency routes than a very, very complex network of low frequency routes. So we think it ought to be neutral at worst and slightly positive at best.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Smith.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, I was very moved by Claire, by your presentation, and I think you hit the nail on the head, which talks about frequency of changing at buses. And I'm very concerned about the 93,000 daily journeys on day bus routes will involve a change of bus under this scheme, as mentioned in the TravelWatch report. Particularly concerned about neurodiverse people who try and memorize journeys, that if they're having to change regularly. I think this change element is really crucial. I'd just like you to speak to that, really, because as I say, I am very concerned about that. Chair, is it okay to come in with a few other little bits and pieces, or?
Yeah, keep going.
On the, you've got 675 routes in London. This proposal will impact 78 bus routes across 23 boroughs. You're going to withdraw 22 routes altogether, I believe. Now, 5 of those routes are in Hackney, and there's 23 boroughs. That doesn't seem fair to me. So that's one point. On the issue of the hopper fare, you say that it's going to affect 0.2% of trips. However, little of this would occur in Hackney, with the average length of ride is 2.1 miles. But 60% of people in Hackney travel out of the borough. So I'm not quite sure how this particular stat stacks up. So there's three bits to that question there. Thanks.
Okay, so 93,000 extra interchanges. So 19% of journeys in and around central London, which is the focus of this consultation, involve a bus-to-bus interchange, and that would increase to 24%. So that kind of puts it, hopefully, a little bit in context. And yes, that's an increase. As I say, what I'm trying to do is to try and find the least worst way. And as I say, another way of doing this is simply to save the same sum of money, but by frequency reductions across the board. But an impact of that is to mean that the 19% of people who already interchange will all have far worse, worse interchanges. And an advantage of this proposal is that we try to forestall that, to reduce that worsenment. And then the other part.
Jeff, if we go on, I'd just really be interested to hear what Alex and Claire have got to say in the context of that, because it feels to me, I mean, I was going to say, Jeff, in this world, dare I say it, it almost sounds as though it's better this way than it would have been the other way. And I don't believe that you believe that. So I'm trying to get to grips with what it is that are the downsides. And it feels to me like it's predominantly about the interchanges, the shortening of routes, which increasing the amount of the fact that people are going to have to change. Is that right?
There's more interchange required, and there's longer waiting times.
Right.
So the downsides. So
I'd like to hear from Claire and then from Alex what you think about this in the context of what kind of mitigations there need to be. Could you switch your back microphone? Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, well, obviously, going from 1 in 5 routes needing to change, or journeys needing to change, to almost a quarter really doesn't sound great. I appreciate, I would want your job, believe me, but I appreciate that something is going to have to happen. But the people who were involved in this are not statistics, they're actual real people with real lives. And mucking up the life that they've managed to get thus far is not a small thing. So I understand what you're saying, but if you've got a lot more routes needing changes, then that inevitably that are having to learn a new route. And for most of us, that won't be a major issue. Might involve a bit of swearing as you get out when it's raining, or there's 12 people from the bus behind already there, and having to deal with the bus driver who doesn't accept that you already swiped in somewhere else. All that kind of stuff you can cope with, but I just can't help thinking about the people who can't do that. You can't do that easily, and will give up after a while and won't go to this college or that training centre or that job interview because they just can't work it out. Or it just doesn't work because there's 30 other people you've got on the bus and you can't. So clearly the planning of it, it's a science, it's an art form, it's beyond me completely. But it doesn't feel like it really takes in the human cost of this and the human cost to the people at the bottom end of the spectrum that aren't the big money generators, that aren't the big earners for the operators or the franchisees. The other thing I just wanted to pick up on, if I may, Chair, is just the idea of all these bus routes where there's 1 million buses an hour down Kingsman Street and 430,000 people going down Old Street. They're not starting and finishing in the same places, are they? So that means there are people all kind of coming in here and then you kind of shunting them over and then they come down. So it's not as if all those people could catch all those buses and they can have a bus every 45 seconds. It's not how the real world works when you're travelling. And as Councillor Smith said about people coming in, I think it was you, cleaning in the morning, also young people in entry-level jobs, they're going to work in McDonald's or whatever, they have to be there at some ludicrous time in the morning because people can't go to work without having a bean burger and a shake or whatever. All their hours are ludicrous. They're right at the end of the day, they're right at the beginning of the day. And they're not catered for, and they're not necessarily living in the easiest access places. And God forbid if they live just outside London and are trying to come into a London job. They're the ones that get shafted left, right and centre. So I'm not having a pop at you because, as I said, I don't know how to make it better, but I don't think it's as least worth as you might think it is in terms of the actual people affected.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'll go to Alex, and I'm going to have a follow-up question about the economic impact of this, but Claire, go on. I'm sorry, Alex, go on.
Thank you. It would very much echo everything Claire has so excellently just outlined. In terms of changes, as Ian said, so it's 19% of current just bus journeys going up to 24%, which doesn't sound like nothing, but it doesn't sound like a huge amount. But again, when you dig into the details of it, particularly there are certain routes you might be more affected, picking out a couple sort of in and around Hackney. We've mentioned the 1 through 5, so that would 23% of those current bus journeys would require a change in future, which is nearly 3,000 daily journeys. Looking at the 205, that'd be 26% would in future require a change, and that's 6,500 daily journeys. So again, it's a lot, and as Claire mentioned, it's these people's real lives. It's not just kind of a number or a stat. And we're talking about change, but in a lot of cases they might require multiple changes. So for some people, I've mentioned the 205, depending on where they're starting and finishing their journey, they could require up to 3 changes. That's a lot. I think that would put a lot of people off traveling at all. TfL have even said that may increase journey times by up to 36 minutes for some of those passengers who for whatever reason can't make that same journey by rail. So again, I think we need to look at that broader picture. And again, where does that come into the hopper fare, where previously you might have been able to make that journey in that 1 hour time slot. If you're having to change, and depending on how long the gap is between buses, that might then put you out of that 60-minute window. So while the bus fare technically hasn't gone up, in practice, because you can no longer do it in that same time frame, you are paying more. And again, it's the need to protect people on lower incomes, particularly in the cost of living crisis. So I think it's important to think about that. And again, we've mentioned the impact on disabled people when making that change itself, and how accessible is that change. And also Claire made excellent points around people who are digitally excluded, and also people who don't necessarily have the confidence, they know their journey, they're used to it, and what do these changes mean to them at a time when a lot of people are still building up their confidence after the pandemic. You know, we don't want to put anyone off, we want to make sure that they're provided that support. So again, don't get me wrong, very much sympathise with this position that TfL are in, and I'm sure, you know, no one wants to be making these changes, but I don't think we should kind of underestimate the impact it can have on individuals. In terms of, I think you just briefly you mentioned about mitigations. I mentioned briefly before, but really making sure that those, both the stops themselves have got, for example, seating, they've got shelter for adverse weather conditions, they have countdown screens so people know when that bus is coming, and having that certainty. That's great. But also between bus stops, if you do have to change stops, again, we'd really push for all changes to be able to be made at the same stop. But if they aren't, is that route between those bus stops, is that accessible? Are there sort of the drop curbs, for example, in place that you need? And then also just touch on, I know TfL have got a mentoring scheme to help people build confidence and skills traveling around the network. Is there something they can do around that, expanding that, pushing it out, or raising awareness of it, and improving that as well to, you know, help people also build up that confidence where, again, changes might have to be made if needed.
Thank you, Alex. Councillor Potter's got a question, then I'm going to follow up on with things on economy, and then Dominic can come in.
Thanks, Chair. And before I ask a question, I just wanted to start off by thanking the many residents who kind of fed into providing additional information, both in terms of recent surveys and also the focus group that Councillor Billington and I were present at last week. I mean, they very much talked about some of the changes that they've experienced so far, particularly talking about the, you know, reduction of bus frequencies, etc. One thing that's quite stark coming out of the focus group is that many of them were, in fact, the majority were not aware of proposed changes to come. So I just wondered, in light, because there was a previous request, I think, made by from the back, maybe Dominic, or it might have been you, Claire, I apologise, about the digitally excluded, and the fact that the consultation was relatively short, and the fact that many residents don't really seem to know anything really about the proposals to come, and so therefore haven't really had, you know, a chance to feed in their individual concerns. So I just wondered whether you had any comments on that, in terms of, you know, whether you think the consultation was sufficient, and whether you think you have reached people sufficiently. And the other question I just wanted to ask is, one thing that came out of one of the surveys in the north of the borough, so quite a lot of residents very much would have liked an additional direct bus service between Golders Green and Stamford Hill, for instance. So I just wonder, as part of the work that you've been doing, I realise, you know, the challenge, and, you know, you've had to, you know, streamline and reduce. Was there any capacity to consider new direct routes that might serve our residents better? Thank you.
Far away first.
Thanks. So I just wanted to come back on some of the points, and obviously Jeff has made quite a robust argument around service planning and how high frequency routes look to minimise the impact of interchanging. And obviously I wanted to say that as part of the consultation, we've 100% recognised the human factors within additional interchange. And obviously these are still proposals, and we haven't got to a commitment stage yet, but we did commit to, as part of any implementation, looking at, as part of interchanging, providing better customer experience at stops and shelters. And that could mean new bus shelters, especially in areas where we've identified that the interchange might be highest. That could in new pedestrian crossings, reviews to street design and layout. And obviously that would be work as well that we'd have to do in conjunction with boroughs to look at how we can make interchange better for people in all different groups. And obviously one thing that we haven't touched upon yet and that we committed to in the consultation was that there would be new training for bus drivers with a specialist provider to provide better assistance for people who need it most. And obviously that is one of the things in feedback. It hasn't been mentioned today, but we hear it a lot about, it was briefly mentioned about drivers not waiting for people to sit down. And obviously this is one of the key things that we'd look at in new training for drivers. In terms of digital exclusion, and I'll use some examples from the most recent consultation, and I will say compared to the consultation that we did in 2018, the response rate for the most recent consultation was something in the region of 6-fold higher. And obviously my role is within a communications and engagement environment, and others will probably agree it is a challenge trying to get the message that things are changing, things could change, and we want to hear from you to seldom heard communities. And it is a challenge to make sure that everyone who can and who's interested in this and has a say to get them to respond. And there are lots of reasons why people do, and there are lots of reasons why people don't. But in terms of the offering, in terms of this consultation, in terms of we had obviously the bare minimum, we had ways for people to engage that weren't able to do so on the website or digitally. We had, I think on this occasion, we had a dedicated phone line, and we had a team of people that would take questions and issues on phone, and we'd make callbacks. And there was, the point I'm trying to make is we put a lot of effort into making sure that people that wanted to engage in the consultation with us had materials that weren't just online and had ways of contacting us that weren't just digital. They could call us, there was a contact center, they could write into us for free on a free post address and so on. And I'm happy to come back and provide further details about exactly all of the different ones, because I've undersold it in fairness. We did put a huge amount of effort, and I think it was justified by the fact that when we did this in 2018, the response rate was much, much higher.
Just to add that the analog, if that's the opposite, ways of consulting, not only in terms of responses, you mentioned telephones and ordinary letters and mail and so on and so forth, but also in terms of the information to draw attention to it and to drive up response rates, which whilst one can contest the 21,500 and why we got quite such a immense response, immense compared to all other ones, attests to some success. So by that I mean the fact that we had posters at little glass displays at relevant bus stops. We had sort of triangular card displays at bus stops and major bus stops and bus stations, for example. We had advertisements in the ordinary paper press and on radio and on even television, as well as, of course, on digital ways. We had adverts in Disability magazine, if I remember rightly, and ways to write in non-digital ways there. And we had an immense number of meetings face-to-face as well. Now, it's a very slow and systematic way of meeting people, and you don't meet that many, but nonetheless, we did that as well, both before the consultation and during the 10 weeks of that consultation. 10 weeks, I put a little bit of stress on it simply because that's much longer than the normal duration of, it's normally 60 days, isn't it? So, and whilst you can contest it, the fact that the response rate was so very large, and we're spending a lot of time going through all those responses, it does say something about the time and energy that went into making sure it was well known.
Well, I do hope, certainly from the conversations we've had that constitute informal consultation with our residents about this, that some of their feelings and not only their feelings, but their experiences are taken into account when the final proposals come out, because the clear feeling that the loss of buses has driven them into cab services or staying at home has ended up with them relying more on people rather than them having further independence, finding that the hopper fare doesn't cover their costs because in fact the interchange has meant that they're all delayed. That was, and an hour and a half on a Friday night with a few low-income Hackney residents who none of whom had known about the consultation. I think maybe one of them, and all of them had very strong experiences of the cuts that have previously been implemented in Hackney, and were very, very concerned about these ones coming forward. I'm delighted you got a proper, good, and deep consultation, but I also know that the quality of a consultation can only really be judged by whether it makes any difference to the final proposals.
I would say that if one looks through the history of bus consultations, then for what it is worth, I put no weight on it, but nearly all of them have changes as a result of it. Now, I realise as I stand here and talk to you, I'm spouting lots of numbers and I sound like a planning bot. So this time I'm merely going to assert that rather than evidence it with any kind of data.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Dominic wanted to come in. Dominic.
Thank you, Chair. Just in response to a couple of points that have been made, and firstly, in response to Councillor Walker's point about night buses, we are very keen to maintain a night bus network, and the biggest users of night buses are not drunken souls on a Friday night. They're workers who work in the service sector, mainly in the city on low-paid incomes. And although Jeff has correctly said that the morning peak numbers are down compared to what they were in 2019, we're seeing an increase in the peak, the early morning peak, sort of 4 till 7, where there has been an increase in passengers, and there continues to be a steady increase through Hackney and around. And although, as being correctly said, there are no cuts to night bus services happening in this round of consultations, we have of course had quite a few cuts on night bus routes in Hackney in the last 2 years, where frequencies have gone down to every 20 minutes or every 30 minutes. So the people that rely on those buses may have disappeared, may have gone to Ubers, or may have changed their jobs or changed their shifts. And I think that may be a separate exercise that we need to look at. It's certainly a cause for concern. Secondly, on the issue of interchanges, I think the planned interchange compared to the actual interchange is something different. Your journey from A to B may not need an interchange when you get on the bus, but it may do halfway through your journey if your bus is running late and you're turfed out at the bus stop. This is increasingly happening with late running. This has been picked up on the Vox Pop on Friday for people who live in the Kings Park area and shop at Walthamstow Central. Before you had the 48, they took their meal relief at Ash Grove, so there was a good chance that you'd go to Walthamstow, you'd come back. Now, because the 55s run from Leighton, the relief point is the Baker's Arms, so you get chucked out of the Baker's Arms, so you have to get on another bus. So your journey to Walthamstow from the Bridge Road may take another 5 to 10 minutes extra there, and possibly an extra 5 to 10 minutes back. That may make you think twice about using the bus. So I think it's important that planners plan the bus service, but another bit of TfL operates it. Sometimes never the twain shall meet. And I think I hope that the twain shall eventually meet. And perhaps that's a lesson for Jeff to take away to his colleagues and discuss it. I'm sure he does that many times. And again, that's all part of the route learning process. The other thing about bus routes is that people change their habits according to the change of the bus route. So I mentioned that one of our early cuts was 308 to Leighton Asda's. And there aren't that many sort of cheap shopping centres around Hackney. Interestingly enough, lots of people from Enfield and Edmonton go by bus to Ridley Road Market because it's a quick and cheap journey. And that's one of the reasons why there's lots of people that have been throughout the pandemic, and the numbers of people using buses on the Kingsland Road corridor has kept up. So it's quite healthy. Not many people want to go and do their weekly shopping at Stratford City, for instance, because there aren't many shopping centres. There's only a Waitrose there, and there's no budget shops. But they can't get to Leighton Asda, so where do they go? Answers on a postcard, please. So I think the message from Hackney is that we have good knowledge of where our residents want to go, and I think it would be helpful if we're able to plug that in more into the bus service planning process, with involvement from elected councillors and from local residents, so that we can try and help shape the network that Hackney actually wants for its residents and workers.
I would strongly back Dominic's recommendation on that. The importance of co-design on that is really important. Claire?
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up on the training for drivers. It's actually been in legislation since 2013 that disability assistance training, not just awareness training, it was there under EU legislation. Compliance has been appalling, by the way, and it was transferred in 2019 into regulations for bus and coach. So awareness training is fairly commonplace, but assistance training is not. And that's a massive gap in people at the front of a bus who've got plenty of other stuff to be getting on with, to have it drilled into their heads what they can do to make things easier. So there is regulation supporting this, and I'm happy to talk to you through about that outside this meeting because we're the registration body for it.
Thank you very much, Claire. Sonia?
I'm going to make a wider point than the Ageing Well brief, just in my capacity as the lead, the council for meeting the equality duty, which is that in justifying decisions, my observation would be that you can't just say that no group is impacted more than any other. And I'm sure it goes further, but in your presentation, that's how it came across. Because that doesn't give you enough granular information to understand what you then do to mitigate. So in understanding equality impacts, you need to start from the fact that groups are not on a level playing field. So which groups are more disadvantaged already, and then which groups are likely to be more disadvantaged by these changes. And it can't just be a statistical exercise, it has to link to the lived experience of residents. So it's just an observation really that in coming back with a response to the consultation, it has to go beyond that no group is more impacted. And I think we've heard examples today, but I suppose the test would be, are groups who are actually have benefited already from hybrid working, better paid professionals who now can work from home, are they the ones who are going to be least impacted by this because the changes have been during, in the peak hours, and that's when, and is it other groups who need to go to work, in some cases to care for other people, or need to be out for other reasons, such as the ones that I gave, that are more impacted? So it's just that observation really, both for the Commission in terms of any recommendations you might pick up, but also in the presentation of the arguments. And then you can start to come up with mitigations that focus on those with dementia, those with learning difficulties, those who, would find a change in a dark place, the most off-putting. So you can then home in on the impacts and the mitigations that are needed.
Can I follow up on that? I mean, quite often I'm not very popular when I say this, because we quite often focus on whether we're being kind and fair and treating people equally. But I sometimes need to ask it in this way. That has an economic impact on our community. People's social isolation not only makes their lives worse and therefore costs the state, but also reduces their ability to be able to be active engagers in the economy. Has there been an economic impact assessment for the reduction of the risks around reducing people's ability to be active economic players as a result of this? We're responsible for a skills economy and growth of the Scrutiny Commission, and transport falls into our remit for precisely that reason, that transport is about connection, not only with the people that we love, but in order for us to be able to be full, thriving economic individuals. What kind of assessment has been made about the economic impact of reducing connectivity, whatever mitigations we might have put in place, to places where there is work and opportunity? Can I get an answer back for them and then bring in Councillor Walker?
Well, the thing about these proposals is that there isn't a loss of connectivity. And I say that because, at the risk of repetition, not a single metre of roads in Hackney served by a bus service now will not have a bus service in future under these proposals. And
Just to
therefore-
be fair, Jeff, if I was on my way to a job interview and the interchanges meant that I was late, and that becomes a regular occurrence, not only for a job interview, but perhaps for regularly for work, those are economic impacts, not only on that individual, but arguably for the community.
So there's nothing in these proposals that will make the bus service less reliable than it is now. And it is a daily struggle to make it reliable, hence all the material up on the screen earlier about things that we can do, such as bus lanes and junction signal timing reviews and the like, to make sure that it is as reliable as it ever possibly could be. But there's nothing in the proposal per se that will make any difference. A little unknown bit of it is that what we would like to do is to have a core network where we do increase frequencies, especially in the early morning, taking Dominic's point about the fact that there are all sorts of workers, often on low incomes, who make journeys at frighteningly uncivilized times of the day, from about 4:30 onwards. And we would like to increase frequencies there such that we have a minimum level of frequency across the day. And indeed, this is much more about the peaks when those professional workers who are working from home are using the bus rather less, and very little to do, and in some cases nothing to do, with the off-peaks, let alone night buses. So the connectivity, my assertion this time rather than anything else, is that we are trying exactly in order that we try and protect the economy. The very worst thing I could do in contrast would be just to cut whole bus routes out unmitigated, especially to places which are isolated, which have poor levels of accessibility to public transport in the round. And that's what we've absolutely tried to avoid in contrast. And with respect to co-design, Dominic know the people that I work with, and I hope that they at least have conversations from time to time. And certainly we also, I live on the same floor of my office block as the bus ops people, and hear their daily struggles with trying to make sure that the bus network runs as well as it ever possibly.
I think Dominic's specific recommendation was that Hackney knows its residents quite well and where they want to go to shop. So it's the co-design with the boroughs and with the councillors that might be an option that we would like to make a recommendation on.
And I have somebody in my team whose job it is to work with Dominic and others to ensure that.
Great, we'll get a bus back to Leighton Astor then. Councillor Walker, Councillor Potter, and then Councillor Premru, please. I'm aware that we're now in the last 15 minutes of the meeting, so do keep our observations short now.
Thank you, Chair. And my question is sort of really going back to the kind of real life human sort of cost of some of these changes, especially in light of the cost of living crisis that we're currently going through. And I don't want to labour the point about the hop there, and I know we've talked about this already, but you said in your presentation that only about 0.2% of journeys would be impacted by some of these changes. Now, many of the residents that I represent really rely on this hopper fare because it becomes affordable for them to do longer journeys on the buses. But what you also said in your presentation was the downside of these changes is that there'd be more interchange and longer waiting times, and this can have a real impact on the journey time if you're making several bus trips to get to your destination. So I'm just wondering how the two sort of correspond, and especially around this, the affordability issue when we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis and people are really struggling.
Right, Councillor Potter, then Councillor Premru, then I'll bring, if everybody can just think about just a couple of minutes of summary of what they'd like to say before we close, everybody who's contributed. Thank you.
I'd just like to say I very much welcome the co-design work that you talked about between Hackney with Dominic and TfL. I know you alluded to, I don't know if you've said it tonight or certainly in the presentation, about one of the challenges has been, one of the reasons for lowering demand has also been slower bus speeds. So I wondered whether there's further work, or perhaps you were alluding to that before, in terms of any work you can do with Hackney to try and make those bus, to increase those bus speeds and make that less of an issue.
And then Councillor Premaru.
Thank you, Chair. It's another affordability and inclusion question. So on Wednesday, the council are discussing a motion, cash welcome here motion, because we know that with the digi-divide and with increasing hardship, sometimes for people cash is the only way that they're not excluded from things. And so my question is, given the unprecedented hardship that people are going into now, a real crisis that we haven't seen, kind of for years, is this something that TfL can actually consider so that people aren't excluded?
Great. Jeff, and then we'll go around to the other contributors for just a minute's summary. Your microphone, please, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks. So yes, the statistic I gave earlier in full planning bot mode was that 0.2% of journeys are affected by these proposals, namely they would tip over the 60-minute threshold. And the intuition behind that is that the average journey length is 3 kilometres, 2 miles. So it's quite short. Now, buses don't go terribly fast, but now within that 3 kilometres, there's a big variation. But a very small proportion of journeys are particularly long. And that's how you square this off, that yes, there are some affected. There are some who go over the threshold already, and they'll continue to go over the threshold. And yes, there are 93,000 more interchanges, and that will mean that there is a slightly greater probability of going above the 60-minute threshold. But it is only slightly. It's real and it's there, but it's only slightly, simply because bus journeys tend to be fairly short in a very large part. So hopefully that sort of explains lower bus speeds. Yes, it's a real problem. That is a feature of something that we saw particularly a few years ago, 2015 to 17, and there are lots of ways to try and arrest that. A lot of it involves bus priority of one form or another, be that at junctions, be that on bus lanes, be it traffic signals, all sorts of things. Often that can be quite difficult to do something about, because quite often it affects things like parking and loading. We have in TfL recently changed a very, very large majority of all the bus lanes to 24-hour, as opposed to only sometimes a day. That makes a real difference. You only need one car parked in the bus lane to make the bus lane fairly useless. So it makes a disproportionate difference, and there's lots more we can do. But there are an immense number of terms and conditions in our funding agreement, most of which involve some sort of pain of one form or another. But in there, hidden deep in one paragraph, is a term and condition that we should have 25 kilometres more bus lane by the I think it's March 2025, so my colleagues back at the ranch are busy trying to find out where those bus lanes might best be, and I'm sure hopefully they've been in touch with Dominic and others to get your very best ideas as well, because now is an excellent time to do it for that very reason. We're looking for the best possible ones, and that's new bus lane, not improved bus lane, new bus lane. 25 kilometres. There's been 300 kilometres of bus lane in London for years and years, decades and decades, last 30 years, my whole career. So this is extraordinary. A 10% increase.
I'm sure we can snap up those 25 kilometres just in Hackney. Right, that's great. Have you got? Sorry, you were going to answer one more. Is that it? Sorry, go on.
Reversing cash fares. Is that the?
Yeah.
So that will be a hard thing to do, and it will add a lot to journey times, because people fumbling with coins is that's the counterpoint of it. So I can't say that reversing that policy would be something that would be immediately attractive, I'm afraid, is my honest answer.
Thank you. I'll go to Claire, then to Alex, and then to London Borough of Hackney for just brief contributions and final summings up.
Thank you. In 2014, you had a consultation about going cashless on buses. That consultation came back 61% against, and you went ahead anyway.
Yep.
It's not surprising, therefore, to me, that people may not necessarily bother to send in responses. I know it's a long time ago, and I've got a long memory because I'm an old git, but it's really important, I think, to realise that if you can't have cash on buses again, because you've done away with all the infrastructure for that now, you need to start thinking about ways in which people can pay for a fare, not have an Oyster card with lots of credit on it, people who don't have a debit card, have them sell it in newsagents or whatever, where they can say the fare is £1.20, £2, whatever, and pay that amount and give them a ticket with that amount on it. Just that you need to pay the retailers, but nonetheless, it stops you having the money on and it keeps people travelling on the cash that they have available, rather than tying it up on cards. And just in case anybody hasn't realised, Oyster cards mean you have to have one for each traveller if you haven't got access to a debit card. So you've got parents there with, anyway, let me not get into that. It drives me insane. But the other thing I also wanted to talk about was just the whole idea of smart technology and digital exclusion again. Just to wrap it up, there are 35% of over 65s don't have access to a smartphone or smart cash or anything else. They are completely excluded from a lot of the conversation, a lot of the free fares, a lot of the special offers. So if you want people to know about that stuff, and indeed about changes coming, put a notice on the bus. Don't just leave it on the bus stops, on the bus itself. And as changes come in, please put it on there saying this is happening now, and get people to point to it, because otherwise they won't know and they'll just get on the bus and go, where's it gone? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alex?
Yeah, thank you. I won't repeat too much what Claire's just said, but we very much just want to echo that, particularly around digital exclusion, which is actually something we're doing research on at the moment, and we'd be very happy to share that once that comes through and the impact that has on people travelling. To say it was great to hear a bit talking about bus prioritisation and increasing or reducing journey times on that thing, and that's something we very much welcome and happy to kind of support TfL and work with boroughs on that where we can. I think while it's really good and important to have that infrastructure, alongside that you also need to have the services running well, which is why again we just kind of call on TfL to kind of reconsider these cuts. I know they're obviously going through the consultation responses at the moment, but particularly around the night bus with people who are maybe travelling home after, working till 3 a.m, longer journeys, the impact that can have on the hopper fares. And, where they do have to make changes, again, we've already said it, improve bus stop facilities, make sure journeys between bus stops are accessible, although ideally make sure those changes can happen at the same bus stops. And then also just look at potentially extending the hopper fare. That's something that we've kind of already spoken about. And I know Jess has said that'd be a very small percentage, but for the people that it impacts, it could be, really important part of their finances. So again, that's something we just ask them to consider as part of their response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to do a summary from London Borough of Hackney?
Oh, I suppose just a couple of points really, because I think we're talking about how can we make the cuts and not impact people, but I think we're the only major capital city in Western Europe that's not centrally government funded. If we're actually trying to deal with climate change and reach this target of 80% of journeys in London being made by walking, cycling or public transport, we're not going to do it by making cuts and not being properly funded public transport. I mean, I know that's not your position, but we're sitting here talking about that, but this is going to impact on climate change, it's going to impact on older people. And I want to echo what Sonia was saying about when you look at inequality and diversity and all those equality impacts, I'm not hearing how we're looking at, say, older people and low incomes. And some of the older people will be going and doing cleaning jobs at early hours in the morning because they can't afford to retire. So I cannot see how this won't impact, because that's the message I am hearing and the concerns we're hearing. And I think we are going to be disproportionately impacted in Hackney because, you know, the level, we don't have easy access to tubes. Our residents do rely on buses, and we want them to be using buses and not using cars. And so, yes, I'm quite concerned about where we're at with this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This is amazing. We're managing to finish on time. Can I just make the observation, and I think it was in the bus users contribution right at the beginning, Bus Users UK, London is amazingly well served for buses in comparison to the rest of the country. However, that means that the rest of the country needs to be better served, rather than for us to find ourselves spiraling into the situation that other places have to deal with. And London has that integrated public transport system for a reason. It underpins our economic strength, as well as leaning against some of our greatest inequalities. I would urge anybody who has any decision-making powers with regard to TfL's budget and decision-making that we do all we can to underpin this as one of the absolute jewels of this city, and particularly for the residents of Hackney, the buses, because we rely on them so much, not just because there might not be anything else, but actually because they're a really good way to get around. And we need to make sure that they are as good as they possibly can be discussing today. I think as a commission, we'll come up with some recommendations about what we would like to be able to see when TfL is having to make these decisions in the future, what we'd like to see TfL prioritise when it comes to decisions around buses in Hackney. And I think we will particularly explore further some recommendations around co-design, so that when we are looking at routes and keeping affordability, keeping connectivity and so forth, it's meeting the needs of our community, not just as it is, but how it wants to be and how it is likely to grow. Thank you very much for all your contributions this evening. It was a really helpful discussion, and I'm now formally closing the meeting. Do I not? No, sorry, I'm not formally closing the meeting. Hang on. I'm being given the right piece of paper. I've got the right bit in front of me. Thank God for Tracy, eh? Sorry, yes, I've got to approve the minutes of the last meeting. This is all the fun stuff. Sorry, but I can dismiss my guest, so that's nice. You guys can go. We end up having to do the paperwork. Fortunately, there'll be a bus along later. We'll get the later one. Minutes of the previous meeting. We have the attached draft minutes from the meeting from the 20th of June on pages 113 to 135 of the agenda. And then we also have the draft minutes from the meeting on the 18th of July, pages 137 to 161 of the agenda. Can I ask the members to agree those two sets of minutes? Agreed? Great, thank you. True record of the meeting. We've got some action updates from June the 22nd. I think these were some specific things that were asked for by commission members. Action 1, the head of area regeneration and the regeneration manager to provide copies of the written reports from the Dalston and Hackney Central conversation with residents' feedback. So they are now attached to that agenda. So we now have those Hackney Central conversation and Dalston conversation reports, which is relevant to the minutes of that meeting. Action 2, in reference to the point on page 35, the March meeting minutes about recyclable glasses in licensing. I think this is a question from you, Councillor Smith. Asked officers to provide clarification about the reusability of glasses. And we have a response that there is branded glassware are usually supplied for free by the breweries. Operators would then purchase their own marked glassware for other beverages such as wine and spirits. And these will go through a glass washer for use. And the policy is also outlined there. Action 3, in reference to the point made by the strategic director, the March meeting minutes in response to members' question about anaerobic digestion. We've asked for an update. That update is there on food waste. And on action 4, the overview and scrutiny officer to confirm the status of the consultation deadline. That was what we were talking about this evening. The TfL consultation in August, closed in August 2022. And then we've had the discussion this evening. So that's all up to date and acceptable responses to those actions. Is that right? Go on, councillor Smith.
Just on the kind of reusable.
You got a
glass.
microphone. Can you switch yours off, councillor Walker?
Yeah, just on the reusable situation in kind of licensed premises, the whole idea is to get rid of single-use plastics, and glass is dangerous. So I was trying to get across the point of trying to find an alternative to glass that's not single-use plastic as a reusable container.
Well, I suggest, councillor Smith, if that's what you would like to do, that you propose it as an inquiry in the work plan. So I don't think we're going to get a straight answer by asking scattergun questions in that way.
Thank you.
So we can do that at a later date. Right, so we've got all of those actions. Is there anything else from the actions that we want to respond to further? Yeah, we're happy with those. The anaerobic digester might also be another one for us to explore in the future. Matters arising? Sorry? And the work programme.
Which page is the work programme on?
It's right at the back. Is there anything in the work programme that anybody would like to? We've got just an opportunity to discuss it. I mean, if again, I haven't got a copy in front of me for some reason, because it's in here. In here, yeah.
So could you point out that the content for council meeting in September for the visit to December?
Yes, that's the most important thing. Because of the death of the Queen, we lost a. Is that right? Am I allowed to say that?
No, we've got a new one. April.
Yeah, I know, but it's whether you're allowed to say that. The passing of the monarch or something. The 19th of September, we lost that meeting. So we're rescheduling that now for the 25th of April. So that now means that we have the content, however, of that meeting is happening next month on the 14th of December, which is about understanding the local economy. Sonia has a new person in her team who's going to do some headline data outlining of where the economic trends are in the borough, both pre and post pandemic. And then on the 9th of January, we're planning to do libraries. Then we've got question time on February. And so the new date, which the new meeting, which was not previously scheduled, is the 25th of April. That's where we've got our new time slot in. Is there anything that people would like to add to the work plan or want to reconsider from how it is at the moment? Put your microphone on.
The timing of the library proposed item, the future of libraries, is it going to be? Would be better to do that in December, as it's we're kind of right in the heat of it at the moment, or?
As I understand it, that January will be the best time to do it because we've talked to people about when announcements are likely to be made, so that this is the most useful time for us to discuss it. I think your point on sustainability and licensing is a valid one. I'm not dismissing it. I just think we need to make a decision about whether we actually want to add that to the work plan this year and do something properly.
Would be good, Chair, if we could.
Yeah. Are there any other things that people would like to consider in the work plan, or are you happy with it as it is? I'll take that as a yes.
I think so, yes.
Fine, okay. If anything does come up and anybody would like us to reconsider or think of something that's becoming salient, then let us know, because we can have another conversation between meetings. We don't have to wait until the next time when we'll gather together. We can do that via email if necessary to be able to take things forward. Okay, is there any other business? No. Great. Then if there is no other business, I can now formally declare the meeting is closed.